On to then the Bush administration, which has taken, and these issues we talked about, social and urban changes. Once again, don't get lost on it. This is taking place in the 90s during the first Bush and the Clinton administration. It's also taking place simultaneously in the Bush and Obama administrations we see as well. It's an undercurrent. The previous slide is an undercurrent to a backstory of our current chapter. The election of 2000, one of the closest elections in presidential history, came right down to the wire, as you may have even remembered experiencing and hearing a lot of talk about it. It's the first election since the 1876 Tilden Hayes election in which the individual who won the popular vote did not become president. So in an extremely narrow election, the Supreme Court of the United States decided in favor of a vote count which benefited George Bush over Al Gore, Bill Clinton's vice president. As president, George Bush initially had what he saw as a rather limited mandate, or at least what the country saw as a rather limited mandate, since more Americans did not vote for him than voted against him. So his initial policies dealt with the domestic sphere, and had it not been for the September 11, 2001 attacks, he probably would have focused centrally on trying to build himself as a bipartisan domestic legislative president. His policies initially involved programs such as the No Child Left Behind Act, which was done in bipartisan fashion with Senator Ted Kennedy, dean of the Democratic senators in the Congress, to try to promote educational reform and standards and accountability in public schools on a nationwide basis. His 2001 tax reduction was designed to try to get more money into people's pockets, as we'd seen tax policy do, the trickle-down supply side model. However, he also raised spending during his 2 terms in office. He modeled his policies on those of Ronald Reagan in the 80s, but he did not enjoy the same level of success. The 9/11 terrorist attacks and the wars that followed have an awful lot to do with why that wasn't the case. The creation of the new Department of Homeland Security and the expenses of the war on terror put him more in the position of Lyndon Johnson with the economy, trying to have guns and butter, than to put him in the position of Reagan being able to cut the taxes and have the supply side model worked to his economic advantage. He did try to modify Social Security programs and failed. He tried to modify Medicare and entitlement programs in terms of their funding, because the issue is going to be, as the baby boomers age and hit that model, paying for these programs once they all start hitting the age of 67 is going to be the great challenge of their times and for the foreseeable future. However, it was the 9/11 attacks, the September 11th terrorist attacks of 2001, where Islamic militants belonging to a terrorist organization, Al-Qaeda, hijacked the 4 aircraft and domestic flights in the United States and used the planes as missiles, destroying the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center in New York City, and flying one into a field in plane crashing in Pennsylvania and one into the Pentagon. These acts of terrorism led the Bush administration to completely shift its priorities and focus from a domestic priority to becoming a wartime president, and to the establishment of the Department of Homeland Security, trying to both secure and stabilize American interests here within the continental states, but also engage in trying to prevent this on an international level from happening again. The emergence of a Bush doctrine, then, of preemptive war, you strike others before they're in a position to strike you, has dominated American foreign policy ever since, either as the policy we follow, the policy we deviate from, or the policy we discuss. It's the policy that led the United States not necessarily into Afghanistan, where the Taliban was headquartered and Al-Qaeda was headquartered. That was a response to the 9/11 attacks. But it led us directly into Iraq, as the Bush administration feared that the nation of Iraq under Saddam Hussein possessed weapons of mass destruction and was seeking to then use these weapons in a terrorist-style attack against the United States or Western nations. So the premise of the Bush doctrine was, before these weapons could be used, the United States had to eliminate them. This was the basis then for the invasion of Iraq in 2003. The great problem was that, as all the best evidence and research has indicated thus far, no weapons of mass destruction were found in Iraq. And the challenge was the Bush administration now had 2 wars on its hands, the Iraq War and the Afghanistan War, yet it steadfastly refused to raise taxes. So this pushed up budget deficits enormously during this time period, and also kept the United States trapped into 2 major wars on foreign soil that began to resemble somewhat Vietnam in terms of the difficulties of figuring out what victory looked like and achieving viable nation states upon our departure. Coupled with this then was the global economy and the financial meltdown that came in late 2008. New trade agreements with the United States and foreign countries in the 1990s meant that many American jobs were left the country and went overseas. The term for this was the famous term outsourcing. And there's cheaper labor to be gotten there. American labor unions, as a result, during this era, have lost power and influence, and service industry jobs rose. But in 2008, then, there was a financial meltdown as that banks that had overspeculated and had overinvested in the mortgage market and the real estate market found the market, not unlike the stock market of the 1920s, overvalued, and the correction that followed devalued the assets of many banks and started a set of dominoes falling that could have led to a financial economic collapse of the major banking sectors had the government not stepped in with the TARP, or Troubled Assets Relief Program, to try to bail out some of these banks from some of the assets that they had on their books that were now kind of worthless assets and devalued. This set the stage then for the arrival on the scene of Barack Obama as President of the United States. By 2008, the Bush policies, both on foreign policy and on economic policy, were viewed as widely unpopular. And Barack Obama arrives into the presidency with not a great mandate, but a mandate to certainly try to take some action, some corrective action, to involve the government and federal oversight in trying to limit or mitigate some of these swings in the economy. As such, President Obama, upon his first 6 months in office, pushed for a stimulus package similar along the lines of things that we're seeing during the New Deal. Jobs programs, works programs, federal transportation and public programs, programs designed to pump money into the economy in a Keynesian sense to keep the economy afloat until the private sector could take back over. This was the so-called American Recovery and Investment Act of 2009. He also bailed out the automakers as the banks had gotten bailed out at the end of the Bush administration, essentially giving the government majority ownership of 2 of the major 3 American automakers for a few years as they stabilized themselves in an employment model and a production model, and were able to retool and regroup and put competitive automobiles back on the marketplace in a time when Americans were then going to buy those automobiles. The signature act of the Obama administration then, by all means, would have been the Affordable Care Act, or as it gone by its more popular nickname, Obamacare. The Affordable Care Act was a policy, an attempt to try to move a step towards universal health care, which, as we said, is a continuation of much earlier ideas. The first president to propose a universal health care model was Theodore Roosevelt in the three-way election of 1912. Franklin Roosevelt sought this at some point in time as part of the New Deal, never got it. Truman had discussed it and considered it, went nowhere with it. Johnson with Medicaid and Medicare was moving in that direction. The Vietnam War denied him the chance. The Clinton administration attempted in its first term to try to get this sort of model passed and failed spectacularly. The president was able to ratify it by a single vote, was able to make the Affordable Care Act law by a single vote, which provided for a health care model where all Americans would no longer be uninsured. Through one model or another, they would possess insurance. Still a very controversial act, as was Social Security during its time, as was Medicaid and Medicare during its time. In terms of gays in the military, the president did away with the don't ask, don't tell policy of the 1990s and allowed gays and lesbians to serve openly in the United States military as part of the cultural tug of war we see as the pendulum goes back and forth. Same-sex marriage as an issue today is also not really being decided at the federal level so much as at the state level. The United States Supreme Court will be in the process of hearing cases to decide the legality of same-sex marriage over defensive marriage acts, which were passed designed to explicitly preserve marriage as a legal institution, a contract between a man and a woman. Promises Barack Obama made on the foreign policy front involved winding down the Iraq War, which has largely been concluded at present date, and also moving in a direction to conclude the Afghan War, with a termination date of 2014. The wind down of this war and of the Afghan War is much more unclear in terms of what it's going to mean for the future, but these are things that will not be tested on at present. The significance of the 2012 re-election of the president is into the realm of whether or not there has been a pendulum shift towards this model of moving back towards a more big government, New Deal style state. In other words, has the conservative Reagan revolution of the 1980s cycled itself out and we're trending towards a newer model? These are questions that at present are unclear, but they will definitely drive the historical narrative in terms of linking events from past to present for the foreseeable future when it comes to the role of the state and the relationship of the state to its citizens. In terms of the social changes of this entire era, those changes as well are the kinds of changes that are going to make America move away from the melting pot model and more towards a multicultural model. And it has an impact, as we've seen in voting and who voted for the current president. The 2008 election, in all likelihood, will be the last presidential election in which either of the parties tries to win purely by gaining the white vote. And as such, we're seeing a real change then in what these political policies and what political interest groups need to be catered to as we move into the 21st century. And those are stories for future lessons, which we won't be talking about here, but future students will when they do their own future AP reviews. Thank you.